Romantic billionaire cries when the janitor says, "I'm not going to have dinner with you." The Pacific coastline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mel Brock Hotel, but Celeste Davenport stood with her back to the view. At 24 years old, she commanded a hospitality empire worth hundreds of millions. Yet at this moment, she felt as powerless as a teenager working up the nerve to pass a note in class. She'd been watching him for 3 months now, not in any predatory way. At least that's what she told herself, but with a growing fascination that bordered on obsession. Ryan Walker. 28 years old according to his employment file, though she'd only looked at it once and immediately felt guilty for the intrusion. Single according to office gossip. Punctual according to his supervisor. Impossibly kind, according to the warmth that spread through her chest every time their paths crossed. The morning sun painted golden rectangles across the Italian marble floors, each one precisely aligned with the architectural elements Victor Ashford had insisted upon when he'd renovated the flagship property 5 years before his death. Everything in the Mel Brock Hotel screamed luxury, from the Murano glass sculptures in the lobby to the Egyptian cotton sheets in every room. Celeste had grown up around this opulence after her mother married Victor, but she'd never quite shaken the memory of simpler times, though until recently, those memories had been frustratingly vague, like dreams half forgotten upon waking. "Ms. Davenport?" Her assistant Jennifer appeared at her elbow with a tablet. "The quarterly review meeting starts in 10 minutes. The board members are already gathering in the Oak Room." Celeste nodded absently, her eyes still tracking Ryan as he methodically cleaned the decorative mirrors in the lobby. There was something almost meditative about his movements, a carefulness that suggested he took pride in even the smallest tasks. She'd watched other maintenance workers rush through their duties, eager to finish and move on. Not Ryan. He treated each surface as if it mattered, each task as if it deserved his full attention. "Celeste?" Jennifer's voice carried a note of concern. "Are you all right? You seem distracted lately." "I'm fine." The automatic response came easily after years of practice. Fine was what CEOs said when they weren't fine, when they were drowning in responsibility and loneliness but couldn't afford to show it. "Just thinking about the presentation." Jennifer didn't look convinced, but she knew better than to push. "I'll tell them you'll be there in 5 minutes." After Jennifer left, Celeste forced herself to turn away from the lobby view and head toward the executive conference room. But her mind remained on Ryan Walker and the question that had been consuming her for weeks. How did she ask someone out when the power dynamic was so fundamentally imbalanced? When any invitation from her could be construed as pressure from a superior rather than interest from a person? The board meeting dragged on for 2 hours, a blur of profit margins and expansion strategies and shareholder concerns. Celeste played her role perfectly, decisive, analytical, demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership Victor had trained her to display. But part of her mind remained elsewhere, rehearsing conversations she might have, imagining scenarios where she could approach Ryan without making him uncomfortable. When the meeting finally ended, and the board members filed out, Celeste found herself standing alone in the Oak Room, staring at the portrait of Victor Ashford that dominated one wall. His expression was stern even in portraiture, his gray eyes seeming to judge her from beyond the grave. What would he think of her current preoccupation? Victor had never believed in mixing business with personal matters. He'd kept his emotions locked away so tightly that even his wife, Celeste's mother, had seemed more like a business partner than a spouse. Her mother. Celeste checked her phone and saw 3 missed calls from Catherine Ashford Davenport, now living in a villa in Tuscany with her third husband, an Italian count whose primary occupation seemed to be collecting vintage sports cars. They spoke once a month, conversations that felt more like status updates than actual connection. "I saw your father today," Celeste's mother had said during their last call, referring to Victor even though he'd been dead for 2 years. She never mentioned Celeste's biological father, the man who died when Celeste was 10. That part of their past had been sealed away, never to be discussed. It was as if those first 10 years of Celeste's life had been erased, replaced by the Ashford narrative of wealth and success and emotional distance. Celeste left the Oak Room and made her way back toward the executive floor, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. The hotel buzzed with controlled activity, guests checking in, staff attending to 1,000 small details that kept a luxury property running smoothly. She nodded to employees as she passed, receiving respectful greetings in return, but no one really saw her. They saw the CEO, the boss, the woman who signed their paychecks and could determine their careers with a word. They didn't see the person underneath, the one who sometimes ate dinner standing at her kitchen counter because sitting alone at a table felt too depressing, who'd watched the same romantic movie 17 times because it was the only thing that made her cry, and crying felt like proof she could still feel something. The afternoon stretched ahead with more meetings, more decisions, more performance of the role she'd been groomed to play. But first, she needed to do something that scared her more than any board presentation or hostile takeover ever could. She needed to talk to Ryan Walker. Ryan pushed his cleaning cart down the marble corridor of the executive floor, his blue uniform crisp despite it being nearly lunchtime. The yellow rubber gloves protruded from his pocket like a badge of his profession, one he wore without shame. At 28, he'd learned that dignity came from within, not from the title on a business card or the number in a bank account. He paused at one of the windows, taking a moment to appreciate the view that never got old. The Pacific stretched toward infinity, its surface catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. On his motorcycle rides along the coastal highway, he felt most alive, most present in his own skin. The wind, the ocean, the powerful throb of the engine beneath him, these were real, tangible, honest in a way that so much of modern life wasn't. Marcus Aurelius had written, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love." Ryan had read that passage so many times he'd memorized it, used it as a talisman against the voice in his head that sometimes whispered he'd made a mistake leaving corporate life, that he should have stayed on the traditional path to success. But what was success, really? His former colleagues from his sales job were making twice his current salary, sure. They had impressive titles and expense accounts, and the kind of lifestyle magazines wrote articles about. They were also miserable, stressed, medicated, divorced, disconnected from anything resembling authentic human experience. Ryan had chosen differently. He'd chosen presence over prestige, peace over profit. Some days that choice felt like wisdom. Other days it felt like cowardice. "Mr. Walker." The voice made him turn, and there she was, Celeste Davenport, standing in the hallway like she belonged there, but somehow looking lost at the same time. The late morning light caught her blonde hair, turning it almost white gold. Her blue eyes, the exact shade of the ocean on a clear day, met his with an expression he couldn't quite read. Nervousness? Determination? Both? "Ms. Davenport, good morning." He kept his voice neutral, professional, though his heart had started beating faster. He'd been working at the Melbrook Hotel for 3 months, and in all that time Celeste had never sought him out directly. They'd exchanged pleasantries in hallways, brief nods of acknowledgement, but nothing more. He'd told himself that was for the best, that keeping distance was necessary given what he knew and she didn't. "I wanted to—" She paused, and he watched her gather herself, saw the CEO mask slip back into place. "I wanted to thank you personally for the excellent work you've been doing. The guest satisfaction scores for cleanliness have increased by 18% since you joined our maintenance team." Ryan's smile widened slightly. So she was going the professional route, couching whatever she really wanted to say in business language. He could respect that. "I appreciate that, but I'm just doing my job. You do it exceptionally well." She took a breath, and he saw her fidget with her blazer, a small unconscious gesture that humanized her in a way the CEO persona never could. "In fact, I'd like to discuss your approach to service excellence over dinner. Tomorrow evening, perhaps? There's a wonderful restaurant downtown, Marcello's. My treat, of course." The invitation hung in the air between them, and Ryan felt his chest tighten. He'd known this moment might come. For weeks now he'd noticed the way she looked at him, not with the entitlement of an employer, but with something softer, more uncertain. He'd seen her pause in hallways where he was working, finding reasons to linger. He'd felt the weight of her attention even when she thought she was being subtle. And God help him, he'd wanted her to ask. Wanted it so badly that he'd rehearsed saying yes 100 different ways in his head, but wanting something didn't make it right. The smile faded from his face, replaced by something more complicated. Surprise mixed with regret, and the heavy weight of secrets he carried. "That's very generous, Ms. Davenport, but I'm going to have to decline." He watched her face change, saw the flash of hurt before she could mask it with professional composure. It was like watching someone take a physical blow and try to pretend it hadn't landed. Her blue eyes widened for just a second, then shuttered closed, walls rising so fast he could almost hear them slam into place. "I see." She managed to keep her voice steady, but he heard the slight tremor underneath. "Of course. I understand if you have other commitments. It's not about commitments." Ryan shifted his weight, and for the first time since starting this job, he felt uncomfortable in his own skin. He hated that he was hurting her. Hated it more because he knew she was already hurting in ways that had nothing to do with him. Loneliness left marks, invisible but unmistakable to anyone who'd worn them themselves. I just don't think it would be appropriate. Something in his tone, a gentleness that felt like pity, cracked something inside her. He could see it happen, could see the precise moment when the professional mask slipped and the person underneath bled through. Celeste Davenport, CEO of a hotel empire, woman who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions without blinking, looked suddenly very young and very alone. Right. Well, thank you for your honesty. She turned away before he could see her eyes beginning to sting, but he saw it anyway. Please continue with your excellent work. She walked quickly toward her private office, her heels clicking against the marble with sharp staccato beats that echoed her racing heart. Each step felt like an accusation. Foolish, foolish, foolish. What had she been thinking? That a maintenance worker would want to have dinner with his boss? That the way he smiled at her in hallways meant anything beyond professional courtesy? That she was someone worth knowing outside of her title and bank account? It wasn't until she closed the door behind her that she let the tears come. They weren't tears of embarrassment, though she felt that too. God, the humiliation of putting herself out there only to be rejected. They were tears of loneliness, of recognition that she'd become so isolated that even a simple dinner invitation, extended to the one person in the building who treated her like a human being rather than a title, could be rejected with such gentle finality. When was the last time someone had said no to her? When was the last time she'd wanted something that money couldn't buy, that power couldn't command, that her position couldn't automatically provide? Celeste stood at her office window, overlooking the ocean that had witnessed so much of her life, and cried quietly into her hands. The Pacific stretched toward the horizon, indifferent to human heartbreak, continuing its eternal rhythm of waves and tides and the slow erosion of all things solid. Outside her office, Ryan stood in the hallway long after she disappeared, his hands gripping the cleaning cart handle hard enough to make his knuckles white. He'd seen her face before she turned away, seen the hurt flash across her features like lightning illuminating a dark landscape, and he hated himself for putting it there. But what choice did he have? The truth sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and impossible to dislodge. That truth had followed him for 3 months, ever since he'd started working at the Melbrook Hotel. Every time he saw Celeste Davenport stride through the lobby in her designer clothes and sun-bronzed skin, every time she smiled politely at staff members without really seeing them, he felt the weight of what he knew and she didn't. He knew that her father had sold a Harley-Davidson to his father 15 years ago, just weeks before dying of pancreatic cancer. He knew that their families had spent 3 summers together at Point Reyes Beach, building sandcastles and cooking hot dogs over driftwood fires and watching the sun set over the Pacific. He knew that a 9-year-old girl named Celeste had once asked him a million questions about motorcycles, her blonde hair wild from salt water and wind, her blue eyes bright with curiosity about everything. He knew that girl had been erased, replaced by Catherine Ashford's daughter, Victor Ashford's protégé, the perfect CEO molded through years of private schools and business training and emotional suppression, and he didn't know if telling her the truth would help her find that girl again or just cause more pain. So he'd said no to dinner, because once she knew who he was, who she'd been, everything would change, and maybe some things were better left buried. Ryan finished his rounds mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He cleaned mirrors and vacuumed carpets and restocked supply closets, but his hands did the work without his consciousness fully engaged. Part of him replayed the conversation over and over, searching for a different way he could have handled it. Part of him imagined what might have happened if he'd said yes, if he'd let himself have one dinner with her before the truth inevitably came out. At 3 o'clock, his shift ended, and Ryan changed out of his uniform in the staff locker room. His regular clothes, jeans worn soft from years of wear, a faded band t-shirt from a concert he'd attended in another life, felt like shedding a skin. He grabbed his leather jacket, the one with a small tear on the left elbow that he kept meaning to repair but somehow never did, and headed for the employee parking area. The Harley-Davidson gleamed in the afternoon sun, its blue paint job reflecting the California sky like a mirror. Ryan had built this bike from scratch over 2 years, learning everything he could about engines and frames and the intricate dance of mechanics that turned metal and fuel into freedom. Every bolt, every wire, every carefully painted surface represented hours of work, of problem-solving, of meditation through creation. He ran his hand along the fuel tank, feeling the familiar curves beneath his palm. This motorcycle was more than transportation. It was his meditation, his therapy, his connection to something pure in a complicated world. When he rode, the constant chatter of his mind quieted. There was only the road, the machine, the present moment stretched out in all its vivid immediacy. He straddled the bike, feeling it come alive beneath him as the engine roared to life. The vibration traveled through his body, centering him in the present moment in a way nothing else could. People paid thousands of dollars for meditation retreats and mindfulness apps, but Ryan had found his zen in a 1200cc engine and 2 wheels. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the obstacle is the way, that what stands in our path becomes the path itself. Ryan had read Meditations 3 times now, each pass revealing new layers of meaning. The Stoic emperor understood something fundamental about human existence. We don't control what happens to us, only how we respond. Dignity comes from that response, from choosing wisdom and virtue, even when circumstances make that choice difficult. But what did Stoicism say about secrets? About knowing something that could shatter someone's carefully constructed world? About being the obstacle in someone else's path, not through malice, but through the simple fact of existence? The ride to his apartment usually cleared his mind, bringing the kind of clarity that only came from wind and speed, and the narrow focus required to navigate traffic on a motorcycle. But today, the ocean highway stretched before him without bringing its usual peace. The Pacific rolled beside him, endless and indifferent, its waves breaking against rocks that had stood for millennia, and would stand for millennia more, after Ryan and all his complications were dust. He thought about Celeste's face when he'd refused her invitation, the way her blue eyes had widened, then shuttered, the too quick smile that didn't reach her eyes, the way she'd straightened her shoulders before walking away, as if she could carry heartbreak with the same professional composure she brought to board meetings. He'd hurt her, and the worst part was that he'd wanted to say yes. Wanted it with an intensity that surprised him, given that he'd spent 3 months deliberately maintaining emotional distance. But wanting wasn't the same as doing. Wanting wasn't the same as ignoring the complications that came with their shared history and dramatically different present circumstances. Ryan took the long way home, adding 30 minutes to his ride by looping through the hills above the city. Up here, the air smelled of eucalyptus and wild sage. The curves demanded attention, required him to lean into each turn with complete presence. For those 30 minutes, he managed to think about nothing but the road. His apartment was small but meticulously maintained, a studio in an older building that had character instead of luxury. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, lived on the first floor, and had been delighted to rent to a tenant who could fix things himself. The walls were lined with bookshelves, philosophy, history, motorcycle mechanics, poetry, the kind of collection that revealed a mind hungry for meaning in all its forms. Ryan made coffee and sat by his window, looking out over the street below. Families walked by with strollers. Teenagers lounged on corners. An elderly couple held hands as they shuffled toward the corner store. Ordinary life, unfolding in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory. His phone buzzed with a text from his friend Marcus. Still coming to bike night on Friday? Ryan stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Yeah, I'll be there. Bike night. A weekly gathering of motorcycle enthusiasts at a bar downtown, where people from all walks of life came together around their shared love of riding. Lawyers and mechanics, doctors and artists, CEOs and construction workers, all of them equal in their leather jackets, united by the understanding that some things mattered more than social status. He wondered if Celeste had ever experienced that kind of community. Probably not. People like her, people with money and power, lived in different circles, moved through different spaces. Even their hobbies were often networking opportunities disguised as leisure. Everything transactional, nothing purely for joy. Ryan had lived in that world once. His corporate sales job had paid well enough for a condo and a late-model BMW. He'd worn tailored suits and attended conferences where people pretended to care about each other's lives while really just sizing up potential deals. He'd climbed that ladder for 6 years, each rung feeling somehow more hollow than the last until his father's death had shattered the illusion that he was building toward anything meaningful. The night his father died, Ryan had been in Chicago at a sales conference, schmoozing clients over expensive scotch and lying about how much he loved his job. The heart attack had been quick. His mother said his father probably died before he hit the floor. One moment alive, the next moment gone, with no warning and no goodbyes. Ryan had quit his job 3 months later, sold the condo, sold the BMW, and used the money to buy tools and motorcycle parts, and the kind of freedom that came from not being tethered to a career that demanded his soul in exchange for a paycheck. His mother had thought he was having a breakdown. His friends had told him he was throwing his life away, but Ryan had never felt more sane, more purposeful, than in the 2 years he'd spent building his Harley from scrap metal and learning that satisfaction came from creating something real with your own hands. And now here he was, working maintenance at a luxury hotel, carrying secrets about the CEO's erased past, and turning down dinner invitations from a woman who made his heart race in ways he'd thought he'd left behind with his 20s. Life, Ryan reflected, had a sense of humor. Ryan Walker pushed his cleaning cart down the marble corridor of the executive floor, his blue uniform crisp despite the early morning hour. The yellow rubber gloves protruded from his pocket like a badge of his profession, one he wore without shame. At 28, he'd learned that dignity came from within, not from the title on a business card or the number in a bank account. Mr. Walker. Celeste's voice carried across the hallway, and she immediately regretted how formal it sounded. He stopped, turning with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. Ms. Davenport. Good morning. His eyes were kind, she noticed. Not deferential, not calculating, just genuinely kind. I wanted to... She paused, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Her royal blue blazer suddenly felt too tight, too corporate. I wanted to thank you personally for the excellent work you've been doing. The guest satisfaction scores for cleanliness have increased by 18% since you joined our maintenance team. Ryan's smile widened slightly. I appreciate that, but I'm just doing my job. You do it exceptionally well. She took a breath. In fact, I'd like to discuss your approach to service excellence over dinner. Tomorrow evening, perhaps? There's a wonderful restaurant downtown, Marcello's. My treat, of course. The smile faded, replaced by something more complicated. Surprise mixed with what might have been regret. That's very generous, Ms. Davenport, but I'm going to have to decline. The refusal hit her like a physical blow. Celeste had expected hesitation, maybe concern about propriety, but she'd been prepared to reassure him this was purely professional. She hadn't expected a flat, no. I see. She managed to keep her voice steady. Of course. I understand if you have other commitments. It's not about commitments. Ryan shifted his weight, and for the first time he looked uncomfortable. I just don't think it would be appropriate. Something in his tone, a gentleness that felt like pity, cracked something inside her. Celeste had built walls around herself for years, walls constructed of business acumen and emotional distance. But lately those walls had started to feel more like a prison than protection. Right. Well, thank you for your honesty. She turned away before he could see her eyes beginning to sting. Please continue with your excellent work. She walked quickly toward her private office, her heels clicking against the marble with sharp staccato beats that echoed her racing heart. It wasn't until she closed the door behind her that she let the tears come. They weren't tears of embarrassment, though she felt that too. They were tears of loneliness, of recognition that she'd become so isolated that even a simple dinner invitation, extended to the one person in the building who treated her like a human being rather than a title, could be rejected. When was the last time someone had said no to her? When was the last time she'd wanted something that money couldn't buy? Ryan stood in the hallway long after Celeste disappeared, his hands gripping the cleaning cart handle hard enough to make his knuckles white. He'd seen her face before she turned away, seen the hurt flash across her features, and he hated himself for putting it there. But what choice did he have? The truth sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and impossible to dislodge. That truth had followed him for 3 months, ever since he'd started working at the Melbrook Hotel. Every time he saw Celeste Davenport stride through the lobby in her designer clothes and sun-bronzed skin, every time she smiled politely at staff members without really seeing them, he felt the weight of what he knew, and she didn't. He finished his rounds mechanically, his mind elsewhere. At 3 o'clock, his shift ended, and Ryan changed out of his uniform in the staff locker room. His regular clothes, jeans and a faded band t-shirt, felt like shedding a skin. He grabbed his leather jacket and headed for the employee parking area. The Harley-Davidson gleamed in the afternoon sun, its blue paint job reflecting the California sky like a mirror. Ryan ran his hand along the fuel tank, feeling the familiar curves beneath his palm. This motorcycle was more than transportation. It was his meditation, his therapy, his connection to something pure in a complicated world. He straddled the bike, feeling it come alive beneath him as the engine roared to life. The vibration traveled through his body, centering him in the present moment. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the obstacle is the way, that what stands in our path becomes the path itself. Ryan had read Meditations 3 times, finding comfort in the Stoic philosophy that dignity comes from how we respond to circumstances, not the circumstances themselves. But what did Stoicism say about secrets? About knowing something that could shatter someone's carefully constructed world? The ride to his apartment usually cleared his mind, but today, the ocean highway stretched before him without bringing its usual peace. He thought about Celeste's face when he'd refused her invitation, the way her blue eyes had widened, then shuddered, the the too quick smile that didn't reach her eyes. He'd hurt her, and the worst part was that he'd wanted to say yes. 3 weeks passed. Celeste threw herself into work with renewed intensity, reviewing quarterly reports until her eyes burned, attending charity galas that left her feeling emptier than before, overseeing renovations that didn't need her personal attention. Anything to avoid thinking about why a simple rejection had affected her so deeply. But avoidance only worked during waking hours. At night, alone in her mansion overlooking the Pacific, she found herself replaying the conversation, not just Ryan's refusal, but the way he'd looked at her, with something that felt almost like sadness. On a Thursday afternoon, Celeste found herself in an unexpected situation. The hotel's head of maintenance had called in sick, and a pipe had burst on the 3rd floor, flooding 2 guest rooms. Ryan was handling the emergency, and she'd come down personally to assess the damage. She found him in the hallway, directing 2 other maintenance workers to shut off the water supply. His uniform was soaked, his hair dripping, but his voice remained calm and authoritative as he coordinated the response. "Ms. Davenport." He noticed her approach, wiping his hands on a towel. "I'm sorry you had to come down for this. We've got it under control. The guests have been moved to upgraded suites on the 5th floor, and we should have this cleaned up within 3 hours. That's not why I'm here." She realized she hadn't planned what to say. "I mean, yes, I wanted to check on the situation, but I also wanted to apologize." Ryan's eyebrows lifted. "Apologize? For what?" "For putting you in an uncomfortable position. The dinner invitation was inappropriate. You were right to decline." "Celeste, Ms. Davenport," he shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong. I was the one who—" He stopped, glancing at the other workers nearby. "Could we talk somewhere more private?" They ended up in an empty conference room on the 2nd floor. Through the windows, the Pacific stretched toward the horizon, endless and indifferent to human complications. "I didn't decline because I thought you were being inappropriate," Ryan said, leaning against the conference table. "I declined because accepting would have been complicated." "Complicated how?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Celeste saw him wrestling with something. Finally, he said, "Do you ever feel like your life is built on a foundation you don't fully understand? Like there are pieces missing from your own story?" The question caught her off guard. "Sometimes. After my parents died, I inherited everything so quickly. There are gaps, years of their lives I know nothing about, business decisions I don't fully understand but have to live with." Ryan nodded slowly. "What if I told you that some of those gaps weren't accidental? That some things were deliberately kept from you?" Her heart started to race. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and grimaced. "I'm sorry. There's another issue on the 3rd floor. We'll have to continue this later." "Ryan, tonight," he said. "After my shift. There's something I need to show you." Celeste couldn't concentrate for the rest of the day. She went through the motions of executive duties, signing documents, attending meetings, approving budgets, but her mind kept circling back to Ryan's cryptic words. What could he possibly need to show her? What did he know about her life that she didn't? At 7:30, she waited in the executive parking structure, leaning against her silver Mercedes. When Ryan appeared on his Harley-Davidson, the blue paint catching the fluorescent lights, something stirred in her memory. Not a full recollection, but a sensation, the ghost of familiarity. He pulled up beside her, cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy with unspoken things. "Follow me," he said. "It's not far." They drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, one of those anonymous buildings with numbered units and combination locks. Ryan led her to Unit 247, his movements deliberate as he opened the heavy door. Inside sat furniture covered with sheets, boxes stacked against walls, and in the center, illuminated by a single overhead bulb, another motorcycle. This one was older, the blue paint faded and scratched, but similar enough to Ryan's bike that Celeste immediately saw the connection. "This was my father's Harley," Ryan said quietly. "He bought it 15 years ago from a man who needed money quickly, a man who was dying of pancreatic cancer and wanted to leave his family with something instead of debt." Celeste's breath caught. Her father had died of pancreatic cancer 15 years ago. He'd sold off personal possessions in the final months, trying to spare them the burden of his medical bills despite her mother's protests. "Your father sold this to mine," Ryan continued, "for $8,000, less than it was worth, but your dad said he just wanted it to go to someone who'd appreciate it. My father kept every piece of paper from that transaction. The bill of sale, the title transfer, even the receipt from the gas station where they met to complete the deal." He pulled out a folder from one of the boxes, handing it to Celeste. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was her father's signature, his handwriting as familiar as her own. But there was something else. A photograph, tucked into the folder like a bookmark. The photo showed two families at a beach. A man who was unmistakably Ryan's father stood next to her father, both of them grinning. And there, sitting in the sand building a castle, were two children, a girl with blonde hair and a boy with dark curls. "That's us," Ryan said softly. "You were 9. I was 13. Our families met at Point Reyes every summer for 3 years. You probably don't remember. You were young, and then after your dad died and your mom remarried, everything changed for you. New house, new schools, new life." Celeste stared at the photograph, and slowly, impossibly, memories began to surface. Not complete images, but fragments, the smell of sunscreen and salt water. A teenage boy teaching her to skip stones, riding on the back of someone's shoulders through the surf, laughter that felt effortless and real. "I remembered you the moment you walked into that board meeting 3 months ago," Ryan continued, "when they introduced you as the new CEO of Melbrook Hotels. I recognized those blue eyes even though everything else had changed, and I didn't know what to do with that information. Should I tell you? Would you even believe me? Would it seem like I was trying to use our past connection for some advantage? So when I asked you to dinner, I wanted to say yes more than you can imagine. But I knew that if I did, all of this would come out, and I didn't know if you were ready for it. Hell, I didn't know if I was ready for it." Celeste set the folder down carefully on a nearby box, her hands still shaking. "Why are you telling me now?" Ryan met her eyes directly. "Because you cried when I said no. I saw it in your face even though you tried to hide it, and I realized that whatever I was protecting, you, me, the simplicity of our current dynamic, it wasn't worth your pain. You deserve to know that someone from your past remembers who you were before all the money and responsibility. Someone who remembers that you loved building sandcastles and collecting seashells and asking a million questions about how motorcycles worked." A laugh bubbled up from Celeste's chest, surprising her. "I asked about motorcycles? Constantly. You drove your father crazy. He kept saying you'd end up as an engineer." Ryan's smile was gentle. "You were curious about everything. Fearless. The kind of kid who would wade into the ocean up to her neck even though she could barely swim, because you wanted to see how far you could go." The memories were coming faster now, flooding back like a tide returning to shore. She remembered her father on that beach, so different from the serious businessman she'd known in later years. She remembered a boy who'd let her sit on his handlebars while he walked his bike along the boardwalk. She remembered feeling safe and seen, and utterly herself. "Hello, my friend. How was your day today? Is everything okay?" The words came out before she fully thought about them, an echo of something her father used to say, a greeting that had meant, "I see you. I care about you. Tell me everything." Ryan's eyes widened. "You remember that? Your dad said that every single time we met at the beach. My father used to joke that he'd made it his personal motto." Celeste felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but these were different from the tears she'd cried in her office weeks ago. These were tears of recognition, of finding something she hadn't known she'd lost. "Why did we stop coming to the beach?" she asked. "Why did our families lose touch?" "Your mother remarried 8 months after your father died. Victor Ashford. He moved you to a different part of the state, enrolled you in private schools, started building the hotel empire. I think he wanted to erase the past. Maybe thought it would be easier for you that without the constant reminders of your father." The name hit her like a slap. Victor Ashford, her stepfather, who'd taken her father's small chain of budget motels and transformed them into the luxury Melbrook Hotels brand, who'd raised her to be a CEO, to be ruthless in business, to never show weakness, who'd died 2 years ago, leaving her everything and the suffocating responsibility that came with it. He never mentioned you, or your family, or those summers at Point Reyes. I don't think he knew. By the time he came into your life, those beach trips were already in the past. Your father had been sick for a year before he died. The last summer we all spent together, he was already symptomatic, though none of us kids understood that then. Celeste walked over to the old Harley, running her hand along the faded blue gas tank. The metal was cool beneath her palm. "What happened to your father?" "He died 6 years ago. Heart attack. Quick and unexpected." Ryan's voice roughened. "He left me this bike and a letter telling me to keep it, that it had been the last gift from a good man who understood that some things matter more than money." "And you restored the other one? The one you ride now?" "Built it from scratch, actually. Learned everything I could about motorcycles because of this one. My dad used to take me for rides and I'd sit behind him feeling like I was flying. After he died, I spent 2 years rebuilding a frame I bought from a junkyard. Same model, same blue. I wanted to recreate that feeling." Celeste turned to face him. "That night I invited you to dinner. Did you decline because you thought I wouldn't want to associate with someone who knew me before I became this? She gestured at herself, at the expensive blazer and designer jeans shorts, at the carefully constructed image of success. No. Ryan moved closer, and in the dim light of the storage unit she could see the sincerity in his face. I declined because I knew that once you remembered, everything would change between us. And I liked how you looked at me in those hallways, like I was just Ryan, the maintenance guy who does his job well. Not Ryan, the ghost from your past. Not Ryan, the keeper of memories you'd lost. Just Ryan. And now I'm hoping that you'll still look at me like that knowing where we came from won't make where we are now more complicated than it needs to be. Celeste thought about the past 3 months, about noticing Ryan in the hallways, about the way her pulse quickened when he smiled, about the unexpected hurt when he'd said no. None of that had been about their shared history because she hadn't known it existed. It had been about the person he was now, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity, the kindness in his eyes that made her feel human instead of corporate. I work for you, Ryan said, as if reading her thoughts. That's a real complication, regardless of our past. And I'm a maintenance worker while you're a CEO, which is another kind of complication in the eyes of the world. I declined dinner because I didn't want to put you in a position where you'd have to navigate those optics. What if I don't care about the optics? You should. You have a reputation to protect, shareholders to answer to, a business to run. Having a relationship, any kind of relationship, with an employee could undermine your authority. Celeste laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know what's funny? I've spent the last 2 years being exactly who Victor Ashford trained me to be, calculating every decision based on optics and shareholder value and market position, and I'm miserable. I have everything he taught me to want, and I'm lonely in the middle of it all. She paused, gathering her courage. Those summers at the beach, that girl building sandcastles. I liked her better than the person I've become. And I think part of why I asked you to dinner even before I consciously remembered you was because when you look at me, I feel more like that girl than I have in years. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Merry Christmas to all and may God protect them. This is a wish from the channel creator, he said suddenly, and Celeste blinked at the non sequitur. Sorry, that's something my father used to say this time of year. A blessing for anyone within earshot. It's October. He believed in getting started early. Ryan smiled, but it faded quickly. Celeste, I need you to understand something. I'm not a project. I'm not going to be the person who teaches you how to reconnect with your authentic self, or whatever self-help language describes it. I'm just a guy who works maintenance, rides motorcycles, and happens to remember knowing you a long time ago. I know that. Do you? Because there's a story people tell themselves in situations like this, where the wealthy, lonely person finds redemption through connecting with someone from a simpler background. That's not what this is. I'm not simpler. I'm not more authentic because I work with my hands. I'm just differently complicated than you are. The honesty of his words settled something inside her. You're right, and I apologize for reducing you to a symbol of whatever I think I'm missing. That's not fair to you. Thank you. He leaned against the old Harley. For what it's worth, I think the person you are now, the one making impossible decisions about businesses and people's livelihoods, is pretty remarkable too. Maybe she could use a friend who remembers that she used to build sandcastles. But that doesn't make her less valuable. Would you be that friend? Ryan considered the question seriously. I think I could be, but not as your employee. That dynamic doesn't work for friendship. There's too much inherent power imbalance. If you want me in your life as someone who knew you before, I need to not work for you. The logistics of that hit Celeste immediately. Ryan quitting meant losing one of her best maintenance workers. It meant explaining his departure to HR. It meant gossip and speculation among staff who'd noticed the CEO's interest in his employment status. But it also meant the possibility of honesty, of relationship without the complications of workplace hierarchy, of rediscovering a part of herself she'd forgotten existed. Okay, she said. What if I help you start your own motorcycle restoration business? Not as charity, as an investment. You clearly have the skills and there's a market for vintage Harley restoration. I provide the initial capital and business space. You provide the expertise and sweat equity, completely separate from the hotel business. Ryan's jaw tightened. I can't accept money from you to start a business. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to avoid. You using your resources to solve problems in my life. It's not solving your problems. It's recognizing your talents and creating an opportunity that benefits both of us. The hotel has unused warehouse space in a property downtown. You turn it into a restoration shop, build a client base, pay me back the initial investment over time. Business transaction, not charity. You're very persistent. I'm a CEO. Persistence is part of the job description. She softened. But I'm also someone who just found out that a piece of my history has been living in plain sight for 3 months. Someone who cried after you said no to dinner, because I'm more isolated than I realized. Someone who wants the chance to know you again, really know you, not as employee and boss, but as equals. Ryan pushed off from the motorcycle, closing the distance between them. If we do this, and I'm not saying yes yet, we need ground rules. You don't get to use your money to smooth over every difficulty in my life. I don't get to use our history as leverage for anything. We both have to be willing to call each other out when we're falling into old patterns or comfortable stories. Agreed. And we take it slow. Start with friendship. See if the people we are now actually mesh with each other, or if we're just nostalgic for 2 kids on a beach. Also agreed. He studied her face in the dim light, and Celeste had the sense of being truly seen, not as a CEO or a business opportunity, but as a person with fears and hopes and the capacity for both strength and vulnerability. There's one more thing you should know, Ryan said quietly. The reason I became a maintenance worker, it wasn't just about having a job. After my father died, I had a crisis of purpose. I'd been working in corporate sales, making good money, climbing the ladder, and I realized I hated it. The politics, the backstabbing, the way success was measured only in revenue and promotions. So I quit, sold my condo, and took the first honest job I could find. Something where results were tangible. A clean room, a fixed pipe, a satisfied guest. Marcus Aurelius would approve. His eyes lit up. You know Meditations? My father used to quote from it. The obstacle is the way. I didn't understand it as a kid, but after he died, I found his copy with passages highlighted. I've been reading it lately, trying to understand what he found so compelling. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength, Ryan quoted. That's been my guiding principle for the last 6 years. I can't control what life throws at me, but I can control how I respond. They talked for another hour in that storage unit, surrounded by artifacts of lives lived and lost. Ryan showed her more photos from those beach summers, her father laughing, impossibly young and healthy, her own gap-toothed smile as she held up a captured sand crab, the 4 parents sitting together in beach chairs, friends who'd found each other randomly and treasured that connection. I'll think about your business proposition, Ryan said as they finally prepared to leave. Not because I need you to rescue me, but because I actually have been wanting to start something like that. And if you're serious about it being a business arrangement, not charity, then maybe it could work. I'm serious. Then give me a week. Let me put together a real business plan. Market analysis, startup costs, revenue projections. If you still want to invest after seeing the actual numbers and risks, then we'll talk about it as professionals. Celeste smiled. You're not going to make this easy, are you? Would you respect me if I did? Probably not. They left the storage facility, stepping out into the cool October night. Celeste's Mercedes gleamed under the streetlights, and beside it, Ryan's blue Harley looked like a piece of sky that had decided to stay earthbound. Can I ask you something? Celeste said as Ryan straddled his bike. That day I invited you to dinner before you knew I'd cried. Were you planning to tell me any of this? He paused with his hands on the handlebars. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wanted to keep it private, to just know that I'd known you once and leave it at that. But another part knew that secrets have a way of becoming corrosive. They eat at you from the inside. I'm glad you told me, even though it's complicated now. Especially because it's complicated. Complicated means real. Complicated means it matters. Ryan started the engine, and the familiar rumble filled the quiet street. Same time next week, I'll have that business plan ready. I'll be here. She watched him ride away, the blue motorcycle disappearing into the darkness. Then she sat in her Mercedes for a long time, not starting the engine, just existing in the space between who she'd been and who she might become. When she finally drove home to her empty mansion, it felt less like a prison than before. She had a friend now, or the possibility of one. Someone who remembered her father's voice, her own childhood laughter, the simple joy of summer afternoons when the biggest decision was which flavor of ice cream to choose. That night, Celeste opened her father's copy of Meditations and found a passage he'd underlined. Confine yourself to the present. She'd always interpreted it as advice to focus on current responsibilities, but now she understood it differently. The present was where life actually happened. Not in regret about the past or anxiety about the future, but in the choices made moment by moment. She'd spent years building walls to protect herself from vulnerability. Those walls had made her a successful CEO, but a lonely human being. Ryan's refusal to accept her dinner invitation had cracked those walls, and his revelation about their shared past had shattered them completely. Now she had a choice: rebuild the walls or learn to live without them. The answer seemed obvious, yet terrifying. Celeste picked up her phone and found herself typing a message to Ryan. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for seeing me. And thank you for saying no to dinner. I needed that crack in my armor more than I needed the comfort of someone saying yes." His response came 5 minutes later. "The armor protected you when you needed it, but maybe you're strong enough now to try living without it. Either way, I'm here. As friend, not as employee. Take your time figuring out what that means." She fell asleep that night thinking about sandcastles and motorcycles, about her father's laugh and a teenage boy's patience with a curious 9-year-old. She dreamed of Point Reyes Beach, of building something beautiful knowing the tide would eventually wash it away, and finding joy in the building regardless. The following week moved with strange duality, time crawling during work hours as Celeste counted down to her meeting with Ryan, yet flying past as she realized how little she'd prepared for what came next. She'd spent years making calculated business decisions, but this felt different. This was about possibility rather than profit, about connection rather than control. She found herself noticing things she'd overlooked before: the way morning light painted the ocean different colors each day, the satisfaction of solving a problem without delegating it to someone else, the small kindnesses of her staff that she'd been too busy to acknowledge. It was as if remembering her past had given her permission to be present in her current life. The week passed in a blur of anticipation. Celeste tried to focus on work, but her mind kept drifting back to that storage unit, to the photograph of 2 families who'd been friends before everything changed. On Thursday evening, she returned to storage unit 247. Ryan was already there, laptop balanced on his knees, papers spread around him. "You came prepared," she said. "You said you wanted a real proposal. I don't do things halfway." He gestured beside him. "Have a seat." For the next hour, Ryan walked her through market analysis, startup costs, revenue projections. It was thorough, professional, completely devoid of assumptions that her money would solve his problems. "This is impressive," Celeste said, genuinely surprised. "You really weren't kidding about the business degree, were you?" "Got it online while working sales. Figured if I was going to sell other people's products, I should understand how businesses actually work." Ryan closed the laptop. "So what do you think? Still interested in investing?" "More than interested. But I have questions." She picked up his financial projections. "You've budgeted for market rate rent on the warehouse space. Why?" "I already offered you unused property. Because the moment I accept below market rent, this stops being a business arrangement and becomes charity. I need to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I can build something sustainable. If I can't afford market rent, the business model doesn't work." Celeste studied his face, seeing pride but also something deeper, the need to define himself by his own terms. She understood that. She'd spent years trying to prove she deserved her inherited empire. "Okay," she said. "Market rent. Quarterly reports an option to expand if growth exceeds projections." "Deal." Ryan extended his hand, and when she shook it, electricity shot through her arm. "Professional," she reminded herself, except it didn't feel professional, not with his hand warm in hers. "There's something else," Ryan said. "About why your family stopped coming to the beach. I thought it was because my father died. That's part of it." He pulled out another folder. "Your father and mine stayed in touch. My dad kept the letters." He handed her a stack of handwritten pages, her father's familiar scrawl filling each sheet. Celeste's hands trembled as she began reading. The letters chronicled the final months of her father's life, his fear of leaving her and her mother, his regrets about business decisions, his hope that Catherine would find happiness again, even as he acknowledged she'd probably marry someone with money who could provide security. But it was the last letter that broke her heart. "Tell Ryan to take care of the Harley. Tell him it belonged to someone who understood that freedom isn't about escaping responsibilities. It's about choosing which ones matter. I hope Celeste finds that kind of freedom someday. I hope she remembers that wealth is measured in sunsets watched and questions asked and the courage to be exactly who you are, not who circumstances demand. I worry I didn't teach her that before I ran out of time." Tears streamed down Celeste's face, each word a gift from across 15 years. Her father had seen her, really seen her, even at 9 years old. He'd worried that she'd lose herself to the Ashford machine, and he'd been right. But he'd also left her a breadcrumb trail back to herself, through Ryan, through the motorcycle, through the memory of a girl who'd built sandcastles and asked a million questions. "He loved you so much," Ryan said quietly. Every letter talked about you, about how smart you were, how curious, how fearless. He was so proud of you, even knowing he wouldn't be there to watch you grow up. Why didn't my mother tell me about these letters, about your family? Maybe she thought it would hurt too much. Or maybe Victor convinced her that a clean break was healthier. I don't think there was malice, just people making decisions they thought were right during an impossible situation. Celeste wiped her eyes, carefully folding the letters and placing them back in the folder. Can I keep these? They're yours, they always were. I was just holding them until you were ready. They sat in silence for a long moment, surrounded by the artifacts of lives that had intersected and diverged and now, impossibly, were intersecting again. Outside the storage unit, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Celeste of those beach sunsets from her childhood. I've been thinking about your proposal, Ryan said, about starting the restoration business. But I've also been thinking about what you said, about that girl who built sandcastles, about who you were before the Ashford years. What about her? She's still in there, Celeste. I see her sometimes, in the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, in the way you notice things other people miss. She's just buried under years of training to be someone else. What if I don't know how to get back to her? Then maybe we figure it out together. Not as CEO and employee, not as investor and entrepreneur, just as two people who knew each other when life was simpler and are trying to find their way in the complicated present. Celeste looked at him, really looked at him. Ryan Walker, 28 years old, maintenance worker turned potential business owner, keeper of her father's words and her forgotten past. He wasn't offering to save her or fix her or complete her in some romantic comedy way. He was offering friendship, partnership, the honest work of showing up for each other without pretense or performance. I'd like that, she said. Though I have to warn you, I'm probably going to be terrible at not being the CEO. I'm used to controlling outcomes and managing variables. Being friends means accepting uncertainty, and that scares me more than any board meeting. Good. Fear means you're growing. Marcus Aurelius said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Ryan stood, offering his hand to help her up. Besides, I'm used to dealing with difficult situations. Part of my job is cleaning up other people's messes. She laughed, taking his hand. Was that a metaphor? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just saying that I know how to handle complicated, and you're definitely that. They left the storage unit together, stepping out into the California evening. Ryan's blue Harley sat beside her Mercedes, the two vehicles as different as their owner's current circumstances, but somehow belonging together in the parking lot's fluorescent light. So what happens now? Celeste asked. Now you go home, review my business proposal one more time and decide if you really want to invest. And I give my 2 weeks notice at the hotel, start looking for the right property and hope I haven't completely lost my mind by leaving a steady job to chase a dream. That's the practical answer. What's the real answer? Ryan straddled his motorcycle, the engine rumbling to life. The real answer, we take it one day at a time. We have coffee sometimes, talk about motorcycles and philosophy and whatever else friends talk about. We let ourselves be imperfect and uncertain, and maybe eventually, we figure out if the people we are now can build something as real as what our fathers had. Celeste watched him ride away, his taillight disappearing into traffic, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the vague, desperate hope that something would magically get better, but the grounded, practical hope that came from choosing to show up for your own life. She drove home to her empty mansion, but for the first time the emptiness felt like possibility instead of loneliness. She had her father's letters, proof that she'd been loved and seen and understood. She had Ryan's business proposal, evidence that authentic connection was still possible. And she had a choice: continue being the person Victor Ashford had molded her to be, or risk becoming someone new. That night, Celeste pulled out her father's copy of Meditations and found the passage he'd underlined most heavily. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. She'd spent years believing happiness came from external validation, successful quarters, board approval, the respect of her peers. But maybe her father had understood something she was only now learning, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or hotels or quarterly profits. It was measured in authentic connections, in the courage to be vulnerable, in the freedom to choose who you wanted to be regardless of who circumstances had made you. 2 weeks later, Ryan submitted his resignation. 3 weeks after that, Celeste signed the investment papers for Walker Motorcycle Restoration. And 4 weeks after that, on a Saturday morning, they took Ryan's Harley up the coastal highway to Point Reyes Beach. The sand looked exactly as she remembered, or maybe it didn't. and memory had painted it softer, brighter, more magical than reality. But Ryan was there and the ocean was there, and for the first time in 15 years Celeste felt like she'd come home to a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. "Want to build a sandcastle?" Ryan asked, grinning. "I'm a CEO. I don't build sandcastles." "Good thing you're not the CEO right now. Right now you're just Celeste, and she loves building sandcastles." So they did. They built an elaborate castle with towers and walls and a moat, laughing as the tide slowly crept closer, knowing it would eventually wash everything away. And when the first wave finally breached their walls, Celeste didn't feel sad. She felt grateful for the building, for the company, for the reminder that some things were beautiful precisely because they were temporary. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in impossible colors, Ryan said, "Your father would be proud of you." "How do you know?" "Because I am, and I barely know who you're becoming. He loved you when you were just beginning. He'd be amazed by who you are now." Celeste leaned against his shoulder, watching the waves erase their sandcastle, and knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this person, this choice to be present and authentic, was what her father had hoped she'd find. Not wealth, not success, but the freedom to be exactly who she was. The obstacle had become the way, and the way led here, to a beach at sunset, to a friendship built on shared history and honest present, to a future where anything felt possible, because she'd finally stopped running from her own heart.